A few years ago, I started to suffer from a lot of stomach problems. Fast forward 4 years, and it turns out I've got a stomach ulcer. Anyways, last summer I had to spend a night in the hospital running some tests on it. The main hospital isn't in my town, so my boyfriend offered to drive me up. We got there quite late, probably around 9 p.m., and when I arrived, the nurse mentioned that my boyfriend couldn't stay. I didn't like the idea of staying alone, mainly because I hate hospitals, so he offered to stay until they kicked him out. We fell asleep and got woken up at about 6 a.m. by one of the nurses, explaining that they'd forgotten to ask my partner to leave. Even though she didn't mind, the head nurse would be on her way shortly to do her morning rounds, and I shouldn't have had a visitor in my room. So my boyfriend offered to go down to the car for a few hours to sleep more, and once they'd finished the tests, they'd let me go. Anyways, this is where it got weird. About 5 minutes after he left, this random guy walked into my room and sat down, telling me the nurses asked him to come in here. I know it sounds stupid, but I guess I was in shock for a few minutes because I sort of believed him. Then I started probing him, and his answer was the same. He was asked to sit in here. By now, my fight or flight response kicked in, well, sort of, and I ran into the bathroom with my phone. Don't ask why I didn't run into the corridor. Again, I clearly don't cope well in these situations. So I get to the bathroom and call my boyfriend, who is crazy protective of me, and tell him what's happened. He immediately makes his way back from the car. At this point, from the bathroom, I can hear the guy shouting, "What's this young girl's name? What age is she?" I don't know who he's shouting to because no one is answering him. Thankfully, I can hear my boyfriend coming back into the room and asking the guy who he was. This must have startled him because he ran off down the hall. When I came out of the bathroom, I noticed my boyfriend had a horrified look on his face. What I should have also mentioned is that I wear contacts, but had taken them out before falling asleep. So, between not having full sight and in my panic, I'd missed that the man's hands, feet, and clothes had blood on them because he'd left a trail of blood across the floor, across the wall, and onto the chair he was sitting on. At this point, I went down the hall to the nurse's station, still a little in shock, and explained what happened. Right away, someone came up to clean the mess, but again they asked my boyfriend to leave, something he wasn't exactly happy about. The nurses were clearly trying to keep me calm as they tried to make light of it, but I knew something wasn't right. At this stage, I've realized the guy is actually keeping a close eye on my room, because no sooner had my boyfriend left, the man walked back in, closed the door, and began walking towards me sitting on the bed. Thankfully, the nurse was present this time and demanded the man leave. I don't think they'd taken me too seriously until now, but finally, they noticed that having a bloodied man continuously trying to break into my room was shaking me, and they told me it was safer to have my boyfriend with me as he must have been the guy's biggest deterrent. Rightly so, because for the rest of the morning, the guy kept walking past my room trying to peer through to see if my partner was still there. He eventually gave up, or was sent somewhere else. I finished my tests and was allowed to go home. The nurses tried to tell me the guy had a head injury, which was the reason he was in the hospital, but they were obviously worried enough for my safety to let my boyfriend stay in the room. What worries me the most is that the guy was definitely watching my room because every time my boyfriend left, he came in right away. It doesn't bear thinking about what would have happened if the nurses had kicked him out in the middle of the night. A while ago, I got a job at a small hospital just out of town. I was excited because it was my first job offer since my schooling. It was just casual work, but I was still ecstatic at the chance to work there because the pay was great, and it was the place where I did my practicum. Most of the time, I would do 12-hour shifts, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Sometimes I would be given the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shifts. I didn't care for those much. I was used to working late from my previous job, but I had to drive a lot further to get home, and the late shifts were usually very slow. Another reason I didn't like them was that there were not very many people on staff, and I would get lonely. Usually there were 4 nurses, 1 admin, me, and the emergency doctor. That's it. Now, being in a small hospital like this one, you see some pretty strange things come in. Some people can't make it into the city, so we've had the emergency STARS helicopter have to drop in now and then. I've seen terrible things like whole families dying from accidents on the curved country roads. I've even had people bring in animals in desperation as there was no vet nearby that was open. One particular night around 10 p.m., I was sitting and talking with one of the RNs about a patient's chart, but mostly just wasting time until I could go home at 11 p.m. The hospital was quiet, and I had only checked in around 6 people into emerge at this point. I remember I was eating my yogurt when I heard a strange noise coming from the main doors. I saw a man walking towards us. He looked mostly normal, but he had a long coat on, which was strange because it's the middle of summer, and even though it's dark out, it's still relatively warm. The RN next to me sighed and got up to go to the bathroom, leaving me to tend to our new arrival. As he drew closer, the strange sound got louder, and something caught the light. He was dragging something behind him that I couldn't quite make out, but I assumed it was metal by the noise it was making. It sent a shiver up my spine. He stopped at the desk, and I could see his eyes were wide, his pupils big. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a while. I'd seen this look many times and immediately associated it with someone who is high on something. He leaned on the desk, ran his fingers through his hair, pulled at it, and ground his teeth. When people like this come in, they're usually looking for drugs. Most of the time, they will complain of a migraine or fibromyalgia, anything we can't prove the contrary of. I processed him as usual and noticed he was getting more and more irritable as time passed. Eventually, when I finished and pointed him toward the waiting area, he asked how long it would be. Knowing that the on-call doc had gone on a quick break, I estimated a half hour. That's when his whole demeanor changed. The anger on his face was obvious as he stormed over to the waiting area, which is a room in between emerge and the front desk area with doors. As he walked away, I got a glance of what he was dragging, and I came to the quick realization that it was an axe. I panicked and almost called the code over the paging system, but I didn't want him to realize. I promptly called the police on my cell phone and ran down the hall to signal to the nurses that we had an issue. The police would have to come from 2 towns over, which takes on average 20 minutes. Of course, as we are all small girls, we didn't want to go near him. He was tall and muscular. Even all combined, we probably wouldn't stand a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me. I waited and waited, but never got a response. I watched the man getting more agitated, and soon he started yelling and asking for help. I hid from him, not wanting him to come back to me, and we devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass is reinforced and the doors are heavy, so it should hold him in there until the police arrived. The plan went down without a hitch until the man realized what we'd done. He started screaming and throwing chairs around the room. He was alone, so we didn't have to worry about him hurting anyone. Then he started using his axe on the door and glass to the front desk area where we were all standing and watching. I've never been so terrified in my life, and what made it even worse was the fact that he was making some headway on the door. It was at this time that the emergency doc walks in the front door of the hospital, sipping on a drink from the Max over the road. He saw us all huddled behind the desk and quickly took charge of the situation. After getting all the necessary information, he disappeared towards the back entrance of eMERG, the way ambulances bring patients in. He unlocked the door of the waiting room and tackled the man to the floor when he wasn't looking, and then proceeded to tie him up with cable ties. He sat on his back until the cops arrived. I was so thankful for having the young, physically fit doc with us on that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think it would ever be enough. As this was the second incident that went down for me as I worked a late shift, I decided to never work late shifts again. I'm now a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 worker, much safer that way. I was in the hospital for about 10 days, suffering from a kidney infection. My mother visited me, but the rest of the family were too busy, so I was pretty lonely and in pain. I used to keep in touch with my friends and family by my mobile phone. There was a young male student doctor who was chatty and friendly to all the patients. I can't remember his name, so I'm going to call him Edward. While attending the ward, Edward used to chat with me. He was very intelligent and a nice and decent chap. He gave me a get-well-soon card to cheer me up. The other female patient teased Edward and said that he should ask me out. I made it very clear to Edward that I did not fancy him at all. I told him he was like a brother to me. Edward laughed at what the ladies had said. He assured me that he didn't fancy me either, and said that a patient-doctor relationship was unethical anyway. After 10 days I felt better, and the doctors discharged me. I said my goodbyes to the other patients and to Edward and wished him well in his studies and career. I called a taxi to take me home. I'd put my mobile phone on silent. When I reached home, I checked my phone, and I'd had 8 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. I was puzzled but didn't think too much of it. I thought I'd ring the number the next day. I had a shower and went to bed. The next morning I checked my phone. I realized I'd forgotten to put the ringer back on. I'd seen that I'd had another 10 missed calls. I called the number, and a man answered the phone. To my surprise, it was Edward. I was a bit annoyed and asked Edward how he'd got my number. He told me that I'd given it to him. I told him that I hadn't. He insisted so much that I had that I even began to doubt myself. In the hospital, I was in a lot of pain and doped up with morphine most of the time. Anyway, Edward and I chatted on the phone. He called me a few days later. I was recuperating at home. Edward would call me every few days. One day I told Edward that I couldn't talk as I was still not well but needed to go food shopping before the shops closed. Edward offered to shop for me and bring the food to my place. I politely declined. After that, Edward started calling me every day. I often didn't take his calls. He texted me saying that he needed to talk as his mother was ill. I answered his next call. He told me that he had just said that because he wanted to talk to me. He said that he knew I had a hospital appointment in a few days' time and that he would meet me there. He told me that he had a new mobile phone for me and would put me on his family plan. I asked him how he knew that I had an appointment. He told me that he'd accessed my medical records. I did not attend the hospital appointment as I didn't want to see Edward. I told Edward that I didn't want any more contact with him and to leave me alone. Edward told me that he loved me and wanted to marry me. Edward kept on calling and calling me. I did not take his calls. In one day I'd have 40 missed calls and 60 text messages from him. He even called me during the middle of the night. I was creeped out and beginning to get scared. One day I had a call from an unknown number. It was Edward. He kept changing his number so that I'd pick up. I was really scared by now. I told the police, but they said there was nothing they could do as he was not threatening me, etc. And Edward kept changing his number using a pay-as-you-go phone chip, so it was hard to prove that it was actually him phoning me. I felt that Edward could get nasty and dangerous. I was particularly scared as my mom pointed out to me that he could find out where I lived by checking my medical records. I asked a good male friend of mine to answer Edward's phone call to me and to pretend that he was my new boyfriend. Well, that didn't work. Edward didn't believe that I had a boyfriend. I was at my wit's end. I wasn't sleeping or eating, and I was terrified. I even had friends over to stay with me. I made sure that I was never alone. One morning I woke up, and instead of fear, I was angry. How dare that stupid little coward bully me and totally take over and ruin my life? I called Edward. I was very firm and assertive. I told him that if he ever contacted me again, I would report him to the dean of his university. I would send the dean all the text messages that he'd written to me. I told him that his career as a doctor would be over. From that day, Edward never contacted me again. I just wish I'd thought of it sooner. I was so relieved as I could lead a normal life again.